Whilst the pro racers get the podiums, the points, the super fans, hordes of coverage, they literally wouldn't be there, let alone on the podium, without the pro mechanics working all hours to ensure that their race bikes are ready for the onslaught of a World Cup track, be that DH, Enduro or XC. I feel really lucky that I've been one of those mechanics working all hours to make sure that their race bikes are as ready as the racers. And because of that experience, I've got some fantastic tips that make the worst jobs easy, or at least easier. Whilst the pro racers are locked in a head-to-head battle for UCI points and podiums here and there, what you might not know is actually lots of the pro mechanics are actually quite pally. So I've been really lucky and leaned into that friendship and got a couple of top-tier pro mechanics to give me their tips as well. First tip is from Jacy Schumilak, who's a long-time spanner for Sam Hill, currently on the Nukeproof SRAM factory race team. I was lucky enough to work with Jacy on the CRC PayPal DH team a couple of years ago. And yeah, it was only 2 years, but I learned so much from Jacy. Lots of tips and lots of insight. And here's two key things from Jacy. The first bit of advice from Jacy is to make sure you've got the mindset that anything that you do wrong or miss on a bike could injure a rider. So if you're making your first step in being a pro mechanic, or you're just helping a friend out at a race, make sure that you concentrate on the job at hand, and that's making sure that all the nuts and bolts that should be tight are tight, because it could result in, well, a small injury or at worst, sort of a broken bone. So be smart and think about stuff. The next tip from Jacy is not to be rushed. Sometimes that might mean that you'll have to forego a nice meal out or some kind of like team gathering or team signing or some fun team activity. I know that I skipped some of those, but it's key because your responsibility as a pro mechanic is to work on the bike. So sometimes you've got to forego the fun to make sure that you can do the job at hand, which is make sure the race bike is racing fast. So some of the tips that I learned from Jacy we'll go through now. So the first one is, yeah, I mean, it's very DH focused. The DH bikes that we were working on, and Jacy's working on enduro bikes now, but the same rules apply. And that means that you've got a bike that's getting lots of use, the brakes are getting heated up a lot, and you've got riders that want really, really precision feel on the levers. So one way to chase out all the tiny bubbles from your brake system is, after you've done a detail brake bleed, and we've got some more tips later, is to either tape, zip tie or secure the brake levers as close to the bar as you can, and then just leave the bike overnight. All the tiny bubbles should migrate if the bike is horizontal, or even if the brake levers are vertical, that helps a bit too. But all these tiny bubbles should migrate up the system and then be in the bleed reservoir of the brake lever, and thus not be a problem. So the riders get a wonderful precision lever feel. It's a great tip. Another tip that I learned from Jacy was moto foam. This stuff is an open cell foam, so water and sloppy mud will pass through it, but big chunks of sort of wet grass and mud generally will stick to it. But that means they're not going to stick on a mud shelf on your bike. So that saves your bike's suspension from overworking. It should keep it mostly mud-free, so you won't get big blobs of it collecting together. It takes a little bit of work to position it in the right place, and most bikes are different, but it's a great tip for stopping mud build-up on any bike. Another tip from Jacy is fuel hose. Jacy developed this one working with Sam very closely, so Sam rides on flat pedals. Sometimes his feet would get a little bit loose, sometimes they'd rub cables, sometimes Sam's trail choice would mean, or line choice would mean that he picked somewhere where it's really tight next to rocks, or rocks would fly up and they could damage cables or brake hoses. So what Jacy did was armour those cables with this rubber hose. So it's fuel hose, it's just about the right diameter, squeeze a outer cable through and an outer hose. And it's fairly thick, fairly robust rubber. And that means that it just protects it from either kind of really heavy heel rub, rocks flying up, or the bike rubbing against rocks. So whilst it's a race tip, it also does apply to trail rides. Because, well, if you damage your brake hose halfway out on a big ride in the middle of the boonies and you don't know where the heck you are, well, if you'd reinforced your brake line to start with, you'd still be pedalling back to the car park. So great little tip for race day and for rockier terrain. Another tip that I learned from Jacy, and thinking back, I think he was probably the first mechanic that I saw doing it, and that's using the 3M rubber mastic trick. So it's a building material, it's a thick tape that's, well, it's an electrical insulator, but we're not using it for those properties on a bike. Why we're using it is that it's thick, it's self-adhesive, and you can shape it and cut it. And it's those properties that make it really good for protecting chainstays, protecting your frame against heel rub or cable rub in different places. And it also deadens the noise a lot. So if you've got a noisy chain bouncing on a chainstay or a seat stay, wrapping it with this rubber mastic will deaden the noise and it will also stop it being damaged. The next batch of tips comes from Andy Lund, aka Lundy. He's a veteran of the World Cup scene. He's currently with Hattie Harmden on Trek Factory Race Team. Hattie's a really amazing racer, having podiumed at, well, Enduro races, DH races, and she's been a national champ at elite level cyclocross in the past. So Andy's got loads of tips and tricks for everybody. Andy's first tip is a good one, and that's buy the best tools that you can. Why? Because good tools make even the fiddliest jobs easy. Andy's next tip is check your pressures. So check your air pressure in your shock, in your fork, and in your tyre. It's the recipe for a good ride. When you're taking something apart, lay out all the individual pieces in order on a sheet. This means when it comes to reassembly, you've already got the correct order to put it all back together again. Final tip from Lundy. It's a classic, shows the depth of talent. This one's multi-tool related. His tip is that when you do your last bolt check before you take your bike out to ride, you do the wheel axles up with a multi-tool, the multi-tool that you're going to take with you. Because if you get a puncture out on the ride, or for any reason you need to remove the wheel, if you've used a workshop long handle hex wrench to tighten it up, it might be too tight to remove with your multi-tool. So just tighten it up with your multi-tool and then you'll be sure that you can remove your wheel. The next batch of tips is from Jake Ireland. Jake Ireland is the founder, owner of Sprung Suspension, a tuning company based in the Forest of Dean. But key for us, he's also a race engineer at MS Mondraker. So he's one of the brains behind the new Mondraker DH bike, the really innovative one that was pretty much launched at Fort William World Champs. So it's got the really clever bolt-in bottom bracket, so it changes lots of geometry. So here's his great tips. Jake's first tip is a good one. And it's similar to some of Jacy's philosophy. So great mechanical minds think together. And that is, if you're going to do a job, do it properly. The kind of, oh, that'll do mentality doesn't really wash. So if you're going to do it right. Jake's next tip is all about brakes. He's worked with some very precise fit athletes, and they've got really precision fit about how their brakes feel. And to help him set that up, what he does is chop up an old disc rotor and use that to work all the pistons. He's using 4 pots. So working all the pistons and making sure that they're all working at the same time. And then also he's using it to set the pad position. So it means when he's switching wheels out, it means he doesn't have to reset the pad position, which is very clever. Thankfully, you don't have to do any chopping because Park have got their catchily titled PS1 tool, which is essentially a cut-down rotor which you can use in a similar way to set bite point and also reset pads. The next batch of tips are from...
You, they're from you.
Oh, that's right, me, Owen, the service course guy. Let's crack on. Owen's mess-free tubelessness. I would say the best hack that I've learned, and I've learned through some very messy errors, is simply to do a dry run first when setting up tubeless tyres. Don't use sealant, just mount and inflate the tyre. If it fails to pop up, add some more rim tape before trying again, before adding sealant as a last step. That's loads better. That's all our pro mechanic hacks and tips and tricks to make the worst jobs easy or easier. Did we miss any? What are your favourite tips and tricks to make the worst jobs easy and smooth? If you've got any great tips or hacks, put them in the comments below.